Good morning. So today we're going to continue with talking a little bit about tense and time and everything. From now on, it's just some optional stuff that uh, is interesting about tense, time, and aspect, and also some terms that are not covered in any other course, but seem to be uh, things that if you do go into grad school or take graduate syntax courses or semantics courses, they seem to be expected of you, even though at SFU they're not taught anywhere else. So I figured it's a good time to introduce those terms. So we're going to talk a little bit more generally today. For all the questions that I have, I'm just going to kind of talk through them, and then at the end, we'll go through some of the tougher questions in assignment 5 and just sort of walk through how those are solved. So sort of the video solutions to that, because I don't think this will take 2 hours. These slides, no, everything at this point on is just extra information. This should not assist you with assignment 6 or assignment 5 or anything after that. Yeah. So everything to finish assignment 6 should have been last class. So we introduced the system that you'll be using for the translations last time. So the operators P, F, G, and H, but there's no reason that we have to just use those operators. So we're not going to use these for translations, but there are lots of different operators related to time that have been introduced in other systems of logic. So I just wanted to introduce a couple of them and talk about maybe the potential problems with translating with these. So some people have introduced operators relating to points in time. So they've used the letters N and B to refer to the next time and the previous time. So obviously previous can't use P because we used P for the past. So they use next and before. So what this means in terms of a timeline is that, well, let's just use one line. Instead of having sort of this general sense of now and then the future and the past, like there's this point I, which is now. So this is a little bit different, where instead of having like this vague sense of time, we now have this very discrete sense of time, where there's just points in time. So there's I plus 2, I plus 3, I plus 4. So that I plus 1 is just like the next point in time. I plus 2 is the point in time after that. So time is just like in slices. And then if you look in the past, you'd have I minus 1, I minus 2, I minus 3, and so on. So if we say like, if we have some proposition P, and P is going to be true or false at some specific time, we could say, well, is it true at the next point in time? So when we ask ourselves, well, what about N of P? Well, we have to take a look at the next point in time and ask ourselves, is P true or false? So we are breaking up points in time and we're evaluating that. So I could say, like when I yawn, I open my mouth, and at the next point in time, I close my mouth. That could be a statement. And you could do that with the previous time. So is that useful in terms of in terms of logic translations and I mean, thinking about things linguistically? It's debatable, because what do you mean by a next point in time? Like how thinly sliced are we going to divide our points in time? Are we going to talk about like event points? Because if you're thinking about an event of like running, for example, sure, a point in time, like a difference between 2 points in time could be like a very, very minor difference in how high you lift your leg. Or if you think about the slices of time being further apart, 1 point in time could be lifting your right leg. The other point in time could be putting your right leg down. So there's a lot of subjectivity in how we're going to define our points in time here. So sure, we can talk about next and previous, but there's a lot of looseness with how we can define the points in time. What's actually somewhat useful are the tomorrow and yesterday operators. Actually saying that tomorrow a well-formed formula is true and yesterday a well-formed formula is true. So these are the T and Y. So again, a little bit of subjectivity here about when tomorrow starts and when yesterday starts. Is tomorrow a full 24 hours ahead? Does tomorrow start at midnight? Does tomorrow start when you wake up? I mean, these are things that the semanticist or the linguist can define, or the philosopher can define. But at the very least, you have the concept of days now. So what is today? It's the 27th. So we have the 28th, and we have the 26th. So if we ask ourselves, tomorrow is some proposition true, we just have to ask ourselves, well, is P true on the 28th? And then we can figure out if T of P is true. So yeah, a few more operators that we could use for translations. But, there's a little bit of subjectivity here. It's a little bit different than just the past and the future, or always in the past, or always in the future, where there's no real argument about what that means. A point in the past is a point in the past. We don't need to worry about specific times. We don't need to worry about what people think yesterday means, what people think a previous time means. So if we want to do these things, we have to establish that time is actually in these discrete slices, that time is not continuous. So that's a philosophical debate, scientific debate. And we also have to establish that we're evaluating propositions at certain times, and we're not just evaluating them generally. I mean, but we've been doing this, we just haven't been saying that. So when we say something like a proposition like Mary likes John, so here's two fun linguistic names that we use all the time. We know that this is in a certain time period. So when we evaluate that, we have to look at a situation, and that situation is in a certain time. So at some time, Mary likes John. At some other time, Mary might not like John. But in this system of tense and time, we'd have to say, okay, but like at what time? So if we were to go crazy and do like the semantics of F3, we would now be in a model and assignment function, and we would be specifying a time for this. So we'd be saying at time I, or at time I plus 2 or whatever, and we would be actually taking a look at a specific time frame if Mary likes John at that time. So that's what we would have to do if we were doing the semantics of F3, but we're not getting that far. So now that we have some new operators, I mean, you don't have to do this. I'll sort of run through this, and feel free to ask questions or stop me at any time. But I just want to take a look at some translations to see how these would look. And we can think about whether these new operators are actually the best way to do these things or not. But we can kind of see the advantages of having them, because there are some things that we can translate now better than we might have been able to translate on Friday. So for instance, in 10a, we have the sentence, in 2 days, the Fire Nation will attack. Now, in our old system, the best thing that we can do, and the best tools that you have for your disposal for assignment 6, are something like saying, in the future, the Fire Nation will attack. Let's just call this A. So, I mean, that's the best we could do before, because we could just say in the future. But now we're able to say in 2 days. So what is 2 days? Well, 2 days is really tomorrow's tomorrow. So instead of making this look like a really thin pie, let me just do like a T like this. So really what we could do now is we could say, tomorrow's tomorrow, the Fire Nation will attack. So we can actually specify in how many days in the future something will happen. And there's sort of a nice way to abbreviate this. We can just do like T with a little 2 above. So that way we can shorthand how many T's there are. So if there's 2 days ahead or 10 days ahead, we don't have to write out a bunch of T's or Y's. We can just say oh, in 2 days, this proposition will be true. In 40 days, so we could do like T40 for in tomorrow 40 times. In 40 days, something will happen. Okay, so actually, the tomorrow operator is pretty useful because we can do a lot better than just say like, in the future, something will happen. We can specify a certain time period. Now, the next sentence, well, let's see how we can do this. So now I will pick a card. Okay, so at this point in time, there's a card being picked. Let's call this P. Next, I will name the card. So, and there's an event, another event happening, and the naming of the card, which we'll call C. But this thing he's saying is next, I will name the card. So the best way we could translate this probably is by saying the next operator. So at the next point in time, the card will be named. So now the card will be picked, and at the next point in time, the card will be named.
Shouldn't you have an operator for the picking of the card as well?
Well, we don't need an operator for the picking of the card because it's at this point in time. So whenever we're talking about the present, we don't need to define an operator. The operators are only going to be for the future or for the past. So picking a card on its own is fine to just be P. Now, the question is this translation actually good? Because what really does next mean here? Does next mean like the very next point in time, or does next mean after this entire event of picking a card? Because what happens when you pick a card in these things? Normally you pick a card and then you look at it and then you show your friends so they know what the card is. And then you put the card back in the deck, and then there's some shuffling, and then he names the card. Or there's usually some stuff that happens. So the question really is like, is the next operator the best way to do this? Or would it be better to write something like this? You pick a card, and then in the future, at some point, the card is named. So again, this is more of a question for linguists and philosophers of what do we really mean by next? What do we mean by time slices, and how are we slicing that time? So the best translation really depends on how you're slicing time. And I think the best way when we actually think about this, and if we were to care a lot, is to say, actually, when we think about times, we should be thinking about individual time slices like I and I plus one, not necessarily as moments in time, but rather like events. Like here's one event and here's the next event. So at the first event, I will pick a card. At the next event, I will name the card. And then our translation, P and next C, it's a little better. But again, I mean, there's two ways to translate this, depending on which system you use, and both are pretty viable. C is interesting. In exactly 2 years, we will go to the moon. Well, how many days is 2 years from now? It's 730 days. It's a good thing that we have a nice shortcut for the tomorrows. So we could write 730 T operators here to be really specific about how long 2 years is. But luckily we have this little shortcut we can write. So we can write T of 730 to say in 730 tomorrows, which is exactly 2 years, we will go to the moon. So that's a little bit better than writing something like in the future we'll go to the moon, because this is more precise. But the problem with these ones is this translation is nice because we have the word exactly. But what do you do when you get a sentence that's like, in 2 years, we will go to the moon? Because what does 2 years mean? Is 2 years a precise time, or is 2 years one of those vague timelines where it says, well, 2 years is 2023. We don't know the specific day or the specific month, but it's somewhere in there. In that case, I mean, how do you translate it? Because tomorrow, the operator is very specific with the day. It goes to a certain day. But if you just say in 2 years, you don't know the certain day, so you have to just use an operator like the future. So that problem still isn't really fixed. Okay. So I mean, eventually with language, you do get into an issue with the tomorrow operator when you're not quite sure what day you should land up on or end up on. So D, thinking about the sentence, I went to a party and then drank from last time, our original translation, I believe, was I went to a party and then drank. So in the past, we went to a party, and then at some point in the future, there was drinking. So this was our original translation. We had these embedded operators going on. Now, with our new one, if we think about then as being like the next event or the next point in time, we could change this instead of an F to be like a next. In the past, I went to a party, and then after going to the party, the next event in time was drinking. Okay, so maybe that's how we could change it, but you know, which is the better translation? And again, there's some interpretation issues here, things that need clarification. First of all, when you say I went to a party and then drank, is there anything that happened in between? That is not clear from the sentence. That is not explicitly clear. So whether or not it's in the future or whether it's the next event, it should be explicitly stated in the sentence if we want the most accurate translation. So maybe the future is still the better way to translate this. Now E. E is an interesting one. So to remind you of what the other operator was, because we're just using like the next moment in the future, sorry, the next moment in tomorrow. We also had the B operator, which is like moments before, or sorry, the previous moment. And we also had the yesterday operator. So this one is E. Moments ago, the earth was flat. Moments ago. Now, if next moment or next time is like I and I plus one, and B means the previous time. So if B is I, then this takes you to I minus one. How do you deal with moments ago? Well, like, what is moments? Is moments one time period ago? Is it 2 time periods ago? 3 time periods ago? Like, what is moments? So this is one of those translations where even though we have the operators that should be able to handle that, because we have an operator that is a moment ago. When we see something like moments ago, it's not clear how this should be translated. And this is more about the problem of language rather than the problem of the operator itself, but it also comes into question like, well, what is I? What is a time frame? How do we define that? So, I mean, we could think like in the past time, like in the previous time, the earth was flat. Maybe we want to put 2 of those time periods there. So 2 time periods ago, the earth was flat. Maybe we want to be more general so we know that we're accurate. Maybe there was some point in the past that the earth was flat. I mean, there's all these different ways we could translate it, but the safest way that we could translate it is going to be with the past, because that's just saying at some point in the past the earth was flat. We don't know when that point was, but that's for sure going to be true, and for sure that's going to capture the truth of the sentence. It's just not going to capture the specific time. So yeah, these translations were definitely not clean, and they had some problems, and we can see the problems with them, and we can see sort of how messy language is. But it's a little bit illuminating for us, because even though we've done so much logic in the course and we've worked with sentences and we've done compositional semantics, there are still some areas of language that cannot be translated perfectly yet. And that perfection sometimes comes from language, like it's vague, so it could be rephrased or paraphrased in a way that is easier to translate. And in some cases, these can be fixed. So now I will pick a card, next I will name the card. That could be clarified in a way that is easier to translate by specifying exactly when that will happen and exactly what events happen in between. Moments ago, that can be clarified to precisely when that happens by giving a specific time frame that we can translate. And other times it's the system itself. What is a time? What is I? What is I plus one? How is that defined? So the messiness of language isn't always solved by the system of logic that we're using, and it's not always solved by taking the language itself and clarifying it. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. So these translations, these systems are always a work in progress. That's why people are still doing research in formal semantics and why formal semantics is still being developed. Now, this is a very, I don't want to say low level, because this isn't low level, but it's more towards the foundational base than it is like current modern research. But these sorts of things are still being studied. So I just wanted to show you some of those operators and the messiness with them. Are there any questions about these before we move on? Because we're going to ditch N, B, T, and Y to talk about some other things, because we don't really have a use for them anymore after this slide. Okay. So this was about time, because we're talking about moments in time, like in 2 days, next, exactly, then, moments ago. But we're going to sort of jump back into tense now. So form of the verb, and also talk about aspect. So if you've ever read an English grammar textbook written by a non-linguist, you'll notice that they have no idea what aspect is, and instead they'll just call it tense. So you'll see things like the present perfect tense, the simple past tense, the progressive tense. Well, they usually call it continuous. Sometimes they come up with these weird names like the pluperfect tense. That's one of those things I've heard, but I can never remember what that means because we don't use that. We separate things into tense and aspect. So English has two aspects, and we'll just talk about English in this lecture, just to keep things a little simpler and more casual. So English has perfective aspect. So this is about events that have completed. So this is when you have an auxiliary have in front of the verb. So have run, had jumped, had eaten. So usually you get like this en suffix or the ed suffix afterwards. Has gone. So went would be the regular past of go, and then gone is the perfect form. So has attacked as well. So these are for completed actions. We also have the progressive aspect. So these are for ongoing actions. So these are the ing forms where you have an auxiliary be in front. So our going is leaving, or eating is attacking, and are smoking. So we don't really have a nice way of dealing with the progressive aspect. We can deal with the present progressive, but we can't really talk about all the progressive aspects, like with the different tenses. But we can translate the different perfects. So here's what has been suggested for the perfect aspects. So when you want to say, and let's just remind ourselves, if we just had the past with alpha, this is like was alpha. If you say the future alpha, this is like will be alpha. So just simple, like 1 point in the past, and future is like 1 point in the future. So when we double up with the p's, so we say the past, the suggestion is that this is like aspect and tense. So this is had been the case. So in the past of the past, alpha. So it had been the case that alpha. So if you say have run or had run, then you'd say past, run. So in the past, running happened. If you want to say will have been, so will have been, you'd say future past alpha. So future is the will, and then have been is the past. So if we think about a timeline for will have been, imagine this is now. You're saying in the future, so it will, and then you're going back in the past for have been. So will have been the case that alpha, and this is where alpha is occurring. Okay, now this is not a great implementation, so I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is just not too good. So one main reason is that there's not really a difference between has been and had been. Now, this might not seem big, but this is big because has is present tense and had is past tense. Okay, so we need to be able to distinguish between these. First of all, okay, so that's one thing, right? But also, like, what happens when you take this like FP and you embed it? So we had other things like in the past. So, okay, we had one case where we had in the past something happened, and in the future another thing happened. So how do these interact together? Is this causing some weird aspect thing going on behind the scenes that we're not too sure about? Is this how they're supposed to interact? Are these eventually going to combine in some way? These aren't ideal. I mean, that might not be a major concern. That might be something that we can work out in the system. But just at a simple level, it's a concern. But this difference between present and past tense is important. Because the present tense shouldn't have an operator with it, while the past tense should have an operator in it. So if we think of had been, and let me just spell out why this is important. If we think about had been as being the past, so past tense and aspect. So you can think of like the aspect being past and the tenses being past. Then has been, present tense, is just losing one of those pasts. So has been would just be a past. If we think about present tense just losing one of those past markers, but then how is this any different than just the simple past? I mean, this is a very simplistic way of viewing it, but this is also a very simplistic change between present tense and past tense. So the solution in thought, in theory, should be simple as well. Anyways, so let's just see what people have done to change this. And this was fixed very early in time. So in 1947, there was this idea of a speech time, an event time, and a reference time in order to figure out tense and aspect. So if you've ever seen grammar books, you might have actually seen these models at some point, but you might not have seen the letters SER, or speech time, event time, and reference time. So I'm going to draw these out on each sentence, but let me explain what SE and R are first. So the idea is that with present and past and future, there's a time where you speak, and there's a time where the event takes place. And usually the speaking time is now, and the event takes place in the future or the past. And that gives you tense. So speech time is the point in time where you're speaking. So usually this is now. The event time is when the event took place. So this is where the running happened, or the jumping happened, or the action. But the reference time, this is what was introduced for aspect. So this is the time that the speaker is using as a reference point. And conceptually, this might be a little bit difficult to grasp what this means. So let's just take a look at some examples. Okay. So imagine we have the sentence, Charlie slept. So this is the point in time that we're speaking. So this is S. I put all the S's in blue. I don't know how well you can make that out, but that's essentially where now is. So actually, let's just put S in the middle for all of these. So we're just going to do S in the middle for each of these sentences to be consistent. Okay. So with Charlie slept, this is just a simple sentence in the past. So this is where the event happened of sleeping, and this is also the reference point. So when we just say Charlie slept, or Charlie ran, or I jumped, the event time and the reference time are the same. So we're basically just pointing to that event, and that's it. We could even say that like the reference time doesn't even matter. We're not making use of it. Just Charlie slept. We're not pointing out a specific time. Okay. But when we say Charlie had slept, we're doing something a little bit different. Let's say the event happened back here. So the sleeping happened in the past. But what we're doing is we're picking a point, say in time here, at the reference time, to pick for when we're thinking about in our head. So we're thinking about this time in our head, and we're saying at that point in time, Charlie slept prior to that point. So at point R, Charlie had slept. So instead of just saying Charlie slept, we're speaking now, we're thinking about a time in the past R, and before that time, Charlie had slept already. So the relationship between R and E, the fact that E occurred before R, the event occurred before our reference, is giving us that aspect. It's giving us had. Okay, so let's think about this in the other direction in the future, and if the reference time is unclear, maybe it'll still help. So if we say Charlie will sleep, we're thinking about the future. So there's an event in the future that will happen where the sleeping happens. And the reference time is exactly the same because we're not really making reference to some time. It's just some event in the future where sleeping will happen. Now, if we say Charlie will have slept, okay. So here's the event E, and we're picking a reference time further ahead of it. So we're thinking at some point way in the future. Like this could be a day from now. Think about it tomorrow, like tomorrow afternoon. And we're saying, okay, at that point in time, the sleeping event will have already occurred if we think about ourselves tomorrow. So we can say at this reference time tomorrow, at R, the event of sleeping will have already occurred. So we can say Charlie will have slept. So it's thinking about E, the event, in terms of tomorrow, in terms of that reference point. So that's giving us this aspect. So it's like putting ourselves, we're speaking at the point in time S, but we're thinking about ourselves in the future and how the events happened relative to our future or past self. And that gives us aspect. Yeah, in this particular case, it gives us the perfect aspect. Okay, are there any questions about that? So what I will say is that this unfortunately doesn't help us with our tense logic translations, but it does help us get a better understanding of how tense and aspect work. So it's not going to fix our problem with the two P's and the PFs, but this system does lead into a different system of translating logic with events that is much better. But again, we just don't have time to get into events, so that's something you would do in a graduate semantics course. So this leads into what is called event semantics. And this stuff, the event semantics is actually really cool. So that's where you take thematic roles from LING 322 syntax. So like agents, themes, patients. If you haven't seen that stuff yet, I'm sorry. You take concepts of agents, themes, patients. You take this stuff with time, and you can merge it all together and make like these perfect logic translations where you can now do gerunds, you can do time events, you can do things where events happen at different times with different subjects, different objects, and you can get these really, really clean translations and really clean understandings of what's happening with truth conditions. Okay. So one aside here, because this relates to aspect, and this is a term that I've seen so much that was never explained to me, but this comes up a lot, especially in papers that talk about meaning, and it's the word telicity. So telicity talks about whether a verb phrase, sorry, I say verb phrase, I say verb here, but it really is verb phrase. Whether a verb phrase is something that is completed or not. And this is a little bit different than aspect, but it is tied to aspect. So we say that a verb phrase is telic if the VP is complete in some sense. And I know the word some sense is vague, and it is vague. And that's sort of the annoying part of this definition. If the VP is incomplete, it's atelic. Okay. So what we mean by complete in some sense means that the event itself is an action that when it's finished, it's finished. So For instance, I'll use the 2 example sentences down here, and then we'll show the tests for how we can prove this stuff. When you make a cake, that cake, once it has been made, can no longer be made again, because once the cake has been made, the cake has been made. You cannot deconstruct it into its parts and then put those parts together again. So the action of making a cake is a telic action. When we think about events that are incomplete in some way, the event of watching movies, so watched movies, although that's an action that you can do, when you finish watching movies, you can watch movies again. That's not an action that you can only do once and then you're done with it. The movies can be rewound and the movies can be watched again, which is different than a cake, which, I mean, sure, you can make another cake, but you can't make that same cake.
Sorry, what does the asterisk mean again?
Asterisk means ungrammatical. So, okay, so the best way to do this, and again, the complete or incomplete in some sense. This is one of those things that even for me, I feel like I have an 80% understanding of this, because there are always some actions that it's like, oh yeah, it's telic in my head, and then I do the test and it's like, oh wait, it's not. So the tests are very reliable. So telicity can be tested using what are called time frame adverbials versus time span adverbials. So time frame adverbials are adverbials like in an hour. So these are things that you can do within a time frame. So within this hour, I've completed this action. So like when you complete something, you do it within a time frame. Compared to something like a time span adverbial, like for an hour. So this is how long you do the action. And usually with time spans, these things are not complete. You just do the action for a time, and then you can come back and do it again later, right? I don't know, like I ran for an hour. You know, once you run, you can still go back and run again. You can run for another hour. So we can use these adverbials and attach them to verb phrases to see whether a verb phrase is telic or atelic. If it takes a time frame adverbial, like in an hour, it's something that can be completed, so it's telic. If it takes a time span adverbial, like for an hour, it's something you can return to and do over and over again. So then it's atelic. So the 2 tests I have here just show you that, for instance, made the cake. I made the cake in an hour. So this is time frame. This means that the event was completed within a time frame. So this suggests that it's telic. While if you say I made the cake for an hour, this is a little odd. It might be grammatical to some people to say I made the cake for an hour, but typically this is an odd action. In fact, if this is ungrammatical, it just might be semantically weird to say I made the cake for an hour. I made the cake in an hour does sound a lot better. So this suggests that this is an event that is telic. It's something that can be completed rather than incomplete. Well, if we think of I watched movies in an hour, I watched movies in an hour. This is very weird. I watched movies in an hour. It's not something you want to complete in a time frame. I watched movies for an hour is a lot better. It's something that you do over a span of time and you can return to. So this is an event that is atelic. It's something that is incomplete that you can return to. So let's just apply this to I solved a syntax problem. So I solved a syntax problem, and let's see if this is telic or atelic. And remember, it's not about just the verb, it's about the verb phrase. Because if you change the verb into a different tense or aspect, or you change the object, sometimes it changes the telicity. So we're gonna do, I solved a syntax problem in an hour. and I solved a syntax problem for an hour, and we're going to see which one is better. So which one sounds better for all of you? Is it A or B? I solved a syntax problem in an hour, or I solved a syntax problem for an hour? A sounds a lot better, doesn't it? Because usually when you solve a syntax problem, you're trying to complete the event. So this is something that is telic. Now, just to demonstrate the fact that if we change things a little bit, we can get different sides of telicity. Let me move this up a bit. I want to change the sentence slightly. So instead of solved a syntax problem, I'm changing this to solved syntax problems. And let's just use different letters here. So now we're doing C and D. I solve syntax problems in an hour, or I solve syntax problems for an hour. Is this, which one sounds better, C or D?
D.
Yeah, D sounds better, doesn't it? So I solve syntax problems in an hour versus I solve syntax problems for an hour. So this event really is more atelic than telic. So really all we did here was change the plurality grammatically. So this is where syntax and semantics do split a little bit. Grammatically or syntactically, all we've done is change a singular to a plural. But in terms of meaning, we've done something a little bit more. We've solved a syntax problem to one event to solve syntax problems and given it this meaning of like an activity. Solved a syntax problem is like an accomplishment. That's sort of the meaning. It's an accomplishment. It's something that you've completed and that you can celebrate. While solve syntax problems is an activity. It's something that you can return to. So this is something that is discussed in terms of meanings for different types of telic and atelic events that, you know, we could spend a lot of time going into so many different aspects of this, but you know, when we change different grammatical items in our sentences, we're also changing the meanings as well and how those meanings are interpreted. So this is interesting, and this is a side that we don't see in syntax. Who would have thought that just adding a plural s and removing a determiner could change how an event is interpreted and also change the type of adverbials that are accepted in an hour versus for an hour. A plural marker can change which preposition is accepted for an optional, for an adjunct. So yeah, this is something you don't really see in the grammar textbooks. And this is also why, if you think about learning other languages or learning English, why there are so many mistakes that can be made. So just a little bit of an aside there. But these are the terms telic and atelic that you see in many different papers when they talk about little syntactic patterns and semantic patterns and why this sentence is bad and why this sentence is good. And they're like, well, syntactically, we don't see a difference, but if we turn to semantics, we see the differences in telicity. And then you're like, okay, what does that mean? Well, now you'll know. So are there any questions about this? Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break then, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about some scope ambiguity with tense and quantifiers, and we'll just talk about that casually, and then we'll go over assignment 5 solutions, some of the harder questions. So I will see you in 10 minutes. Okay, let's talk about ambiguity. So if we remember the trees from last time, I'll just kind of remind you, we introduced the TP. So now we can do tense in our syntactic trees. So instead of having something like S to NP to VP, V, and then another NP, we can now replace the S with a TP. And with that TP comes the introduction of the T bar node and the T node, and the T node has tense on it. So on all of these, I'm going to use green to indicate tense. And here is the tree every duck swam. And what I've done is I've done some quantifier raising on it. So for quantifier raising, it's going to work the same way, but instead of having, say, two S's, we just introduce a new TP layer instead because we don't have S's anymore. But we don't need to introduce new T bars or new T's at every level. We just do, basically every place we had an S, we would just do a new TP. So if I do the arrows, T1, every duck has moved up. So actually, the sentence every duck swam has two different meanings. And this might not be something that we think about, but every simple past tense sentence with a quantifier, like every or all, has two meanings to it. So the first question is, what are those meanings? And the meanings come from an interaction between the quantifier, so I'll circle that, comes with every, and the tense, the past. So it might not be obvious what the meanings are right away, but let me just spell them out for you. I'll just make this box a little bit smaller so it doesn't go over the tree. One meaning is that every duck at some point or other in the past swam. So this could mean like, let me draw a timeline here. So here's now. This could mean that at this point, this is where duck 1 swam. At this point, this is where duck 2 swam. At this point, this is where duck 3 swam. So every duck swam. That means at some point or other in the past, all of those ducks swam. But there is a second meaning that we can have here. We can say at a particular point in time, all the ducks swam. That is another possible interpretation of this sentence. It's probably not the one that you go for in your head, but there are some situations where you might think of that one. So if this is now, there might be a particular point in the past, let's say here, where duck 1, duck 2, and duck 3, all the ducks swam at that particular point. So there's two interpretations for this sentence, every duck swam. Now the question is, a lot like our scope ambiguous sentences, how do we get these two different interpretations from this syntactic tree? Because with quantifier raising, we're only going to get one tree. In fact, even if we don't do movement, the subject, every duck, is still in roughly the same place. It's ahead of past. So how are we going to get two different interpretations? Well, we're going to employ the same strategy as we did with quantifiers. And these interpretations are written on the next slide. So if you haven't written them down, don't worry, they're repeated. We are going to do what's called tense raising. So like quantifier raising, we can also raise tense. So if we think about the fact that both quantifiers and tense can be raised now, we can get two different orderings of quantified nouns and tense in our trees. And at this point, you can be thankful that we're not doing semantic composition on these trees, because we totally could. So we have one sentence where we have every duck moving up first, and then we have tense moving up. So we can see that tense has moved from our original position under T bar up into this new position under TP. So it works exactly the same as quantifier raising. We introduce a new TP node, so like a new S node essentially, and then we just place whatever's been moved on its left side. Okay, and this gives us the interpretation where first we focus on particular time, and then we focus on the fact that every duck swam afterwards. So this is the case where this is now, and all the ducks are at that particular time. In the other version of the sentence, first, what we might do is we might move tense up first, and then we move up every duck afterwards. So in this case, we focus on every duck first, and then our second priority is the time. So in this particular case, in our timeline, let's say this is now, we might have different spots for different ducks. So it's like having scope ambiguity. I mean, it is scope ambiguity. It's just the difference between having two quantifiers with scope ambiguity. We now have a quantifier and tense in scope ambiguity. So all those times we drew out those diagrams with like 5 dots and 1 dot, and 5 dots and 5 dots. I mean, really, we're kind of doing the same thing here. It's 2 ducks to 1 time versus 2 ducks to 2 times. It's just now instead of dots, we're putting them on a timeline. But the interpretations are still similar in style. So again, I don't want to spend too much time on these. It's just the general concepts and saying like, what could we do at this point? So if we have tense and quantifier ambiguity, you can imagine how complicated this can get if we have 2 quantified noun phrases in our tree. And certainly it can get complicated. So let's take a look at that. Here's the sentence, every actor loved some movie. And I won't show all 4 trees. I'll just show 2 of the 4 trees. But we can get scope ambiguity with quantifiers and tense at the same time. Now, the only thing about tense raising and quantifier raising is that we do tense raising before or after quantifier raising. We don't like intermingle them. So we don't do like 1 quantifier raise, then 1 tense raise, then 1 quantifier raise. No, we do like all quantifiers, then tense, or tense and then all quantifiers. So for example, we can do, in this case, first we move, it's not the right color. First we move tense up. So that could be the first thing we do. Now that all tense raising is complete, then we can do quantifier movement. So then we can move every actor up, and then we can move some movie up. So we won't worry about the interpretations here, just because these get a little bit complicated. But this is basically every actor loves some movie, but with the timeline involved. So was this a particular point in the past where every actor loves some movie, or were these at different points in the past?
Is this stuff gonna be on the test?
No, everything today is just extra information.
Okay, thank you.
Also, again, I'm not showing these because I don't want to fit 4 trees on the page, but with scope ambiguity, these two could be switched as well with regular scope ambiguity. So it could be every actor on top and some movie on the bottom. That could be another tree. The alternative with tense is first the quantifiers move. So first we could have every actor move up, then we could have some movie move up. So first we could do quantifier raising, and then after all that, then we could have tense move up to the higher position. So this would be the particular point in time reading. So there's a particular point in time where every actor loves some movie in the past. So again, these trees can get very complicated, and we can do compositional semantics on them if we introduce a system for precisely how to interpret the past. Now, so complicated, but that's not all. And because we're talking about it casually, we can take this as far as we want, so why not take it a little bit further? Just to show how far we can go. We can throw in some negation in here too, and find some negation ambiguity. So what about the sentence, John did not love Mary? This is a sentence that has 2 readings as well, or 2 interpretations. This one I think is a little bit harder to get at than the 2 interpretations for the past. At least in my mind, this might vary from person to person, but I struggle a little bit with this one. So what are the 2 interpretations for this sentence? John did not love Mary. So there's one interpretation that says in the past, so I should say at some point in the past, John didn't love Mary. Okay, so you're focusing on the point in the past first, and then you're focusing on the fact that John doesn't love Mary. Okay. The second interpretation is very, very similar, and I struggle sometimes to paraphrase it. So John did not love Mary. So it's not the case that John loved Mary at some point in the past. That's the second interpretation. Now, these have different meanings, and let me space these out a little bit just to draw what this means. Okay, so if we do a little timeline here and here, here's now with our red mark here. So the first interpretation says at some point in the past, John didn't love Mary. So we could say at this point here, there was no love. So I'll put a little heart with a cross through it. Okay, so that's one interpretation. There was some point in the past where John didn't love Mary, and we don't know about the other times. Maybe John didn't love Mary through all that time. Maybe John loved Mary some of those other times. We don't know. The other interpretations say it's not the case that John loved Mary at some point in the past. So this means that throughout all of these times, there was no love. John didn't love Mary at any of those times. So we can see the difference between the 2 interpretations. The first interpretation is very specific, talking about a specific point, while the second interpretation is much more general. Now, as humans, we have a preference for one interpretation over the other when we hear one, like John did not love Mary. We probably expect it. to be the second one. Yeah, John didn't love Mary. Well, until now, you would expect that until now or until a certain point, or maybe John still doesn't love Mary. But you would expect it to, you would expect no love until a certain point. But both interpretations are possible. So, how do we get these two interpretations? Well, first of all, we need to figure out how to get not into our tree. And then we need to figure out how to get two interpretations, which, by the way, is going to be raising. So we haven't done this in the course for good reason, because negation inside our clauses causes issues, a lot of issues. Because mainly every time you get negation inside a clause, you can get scope ambiguity. So here's how we can do it. And here's how you would do this in syntax. So you would take the T bar node and the VP node, and you would introduce what's called a negation phrase in between the two. So after tense is introduced, but before the verb, you can introduce not. So John not love Mary. So that's how we're going to introduce negation. We're not going to introduce the word did or do in our tree. It's just a little bit too complicated to figure out how to do all the movement and stuff, because we don't have C's or CPs. So we're just going to leave it as John not love Mary. Okay, so for our final demonstration, let's show how we can get these two interpretations with some raising, specifically negation raising. And our two interpretations will be on the next slide as well. So negation raising is going to work the same way as tense raising and quantifier raising. And again, if only we had time for some composition in F3, we could do all this stuff piece by piece. But again, that would take a couple weeks. So we can do one where we raise tense first, and then we raise negation second. And again, it's just the same process as before. We introduce a new TP above, and we put negation from where it's being moved. So this is one interpretation. And again, we just go by the way of what's on top. That's our focus. So we have negation at the top. So our focus is, it is not the case that is the first focus. Then the second focus, the past is below. So the second focus is, there was a point in the past such that John loved Mary. So this is saying at no point in the past did John love Mary. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation on the tree on the right says that first we move up negation, and then we move up tense. So this focuses on the fact that there was a point in the past, and then it focuses on the fact that then John did not love Mary. So this interpretation on the right, let me just draw up this timeline. This is the timeline where there was a particular point in the past without any love. But again, the process for solving all of these different scope ambiguities is just take whatever category you have that needs to be raised and just raise it to the top. And this is all done in logical form, so this isn't affecting how you're talking. This isn't affecting how people are hearing your words. This is just how computers and how our brains, well, theoretically how we're interpreting the sentence. So yeah, this is a tense, quantifiers, negation, all the things that have been sort of lurking in the background of syntax and semantics that we didn't really have the time to do composition on, just to show you what's out there. Are there any questions about tense ambiguity, negation ambiguity, quantifier ambiguity, or anything else further in this field that you're a little bit interested about? I'm happy to answer any questions.
Sorry, this is just an aside. When's the last day of class?
Last day of class for us. So the final test will be on the 6th, and our last lecture will be on the 3rd.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think I had one more question actually, but Oh yeah, this question. Oh no. Um, yeah, okay. I'm a little scared of this. We won't draw this, but this is just a question. Um, can we still schedule office hours with you after August 3rd? Yes, yes. And anytime up to the final, anytime up to test 3, I'll be available. After test 3, I'll still be available, but my hours will be a little bit more limited because end of course administration stuff and marking that have to be put in. If we think about the sentence, every person did not kill John, and we think about like how many different ways that we can draw this sentence and how many different interpretations it can have, uh, these things get a little wild. So for instance, every person, we have to do quantifier raising with every person. With did, we have tense here. So we have to do tense raising with did. With not, we have negation raising. So we have to do negation raising with not. And each time that we do one of these scope ambiguous interpretations, we essentially have 2 different ways of ordering them. Are we moving them up to the top, or are we moving them earlier? So when we think about how many different ways we can order these things, either it's going to be, if we think about the different orders, we can either have every at the top and then plus past and then not. If we think of our ordering, we can have every and then not and then plus past. We could have not at the front and then every and then plus past. We could have not and then plus past and then every. We could put plus past to the top and then every and then not, or we could put plus past to the top and then not and then every. So just by having a quantifier, a tense, and a negation in our tree, we can have 6 different interpretations for our sentence. So every person did not kill John theoretically has 6 different interpretations. Now, they're not all going to be obvious, and they're not going to be easily paraphrasable, but theoretically, those 6 interpretations exist. And that is why we do not look at sentences like this in this course, because the sentences do get nasty and they do get complicated. But yeah, this is where semantics can go. And these are the different types of things that you can look at in truth conditional semantics. Not to mention, there's still this whole world of modals like should and must. There's a whole world of these knowledge words like know and belief. There's events and gerunds and so much more. But anyways, that's enough for truth conditional semantics. Let's move on to assignment 5. And I mean, we can still wrap up the course next Tuesday when we talk about jokes and pragmatics and talk a little bit more about what's out there in semantics. So I'll leave that for next Tuesday. Anyways, let's talk about some of the stuff that's in assignment 5. And if you need me to go back or talk about anything again in this lecture, I'm happy to stick around at the end and go over that. So there's still a few left that have to be marked. I was not feeling well this weekend. I'm still not in the best condition, but I'll try to have it done by next class for sure. So I do know what people have struggled with. So let's take a look at this. The first one that people struggled with was B. Now this was scope ambiguous, which was my fault. I didn't intend for this to be a scope ambiguous sentence, so I didn't require both translations. I just required one because it was not supposed to be as difficult as I made it. I took an old sentence I had with adjectives and I changed them to noun phrases, forgetting that noun phrases cause scope ambiguous, scope ambiguity. So every jester entertains a king or a queen. Now, most people got the for all X, jester X, arrow part fine. What struggles came after this were like a king or a queen. So what we have to remember is that whenever we have a noun phrase or a predicate, something like king or queen, these are new predicates. So these are sort of like intransitive verbs, like king X or queen X. But these also have to be bound by something new. So we have to say, in particular, a king or a queen. So we need to use a new existential, like exists a y, that we can bound these new predicates with. So we can say there exists a y such that y is a king, or y is a queen. So we're specifying that there's some new object that is a king or a queen, and then entertaining. So entertain is a verb, and entertain is a transitive verb. So X entertains Y in this case. Something entertains something else. So X is the entertainer, X is the jester, and Y is the king or a queen. So that would be like that. Can king and queen be two different variables like king Y and queen Z? Yeah, if you introduce king Y and queen Z, that would be fine. You would get, I mean, you'd end up with a sentence like every jester entertains a king or every jester entertains a queen, which is slightly different than the interpretation of the sentence given. But it's close enough that with the way that I worded the question unintentionally, I'm okay to give it to you for this one. So yeah, you could do king Y or queen Z in this case, but it would be better if because it's a king or a queen as one compound noun phrase, it would be better to use the same variable for both, like a king Y or a queen Y. So that one had some small troubles. Every robot who takes an order receives it. Yeah, this one was troubling for a different reason entirely. This one was troubling because of the fact that you have an order with robot in a relative clause. And this one was also more difficult than I intended it to be. So I was also pretty lenient with this one. The reason this was difficult was because there was an object in the relative clause instead of just it being an intransitive verb, which made it a little bit more difficult. So the way that this could be done, two ways really, is establishing that there is an order up front. So you could say something like there is an order and for every robot X. So there is some order Y, and for every robot X, such that, well, X is a robot and X takes Y. So the robot takes the order. That's important. Then the robot receives the order. So X receives Y. That is one way of doing it. The other way of doing it, which was a little bit less intuitive, would be like bringing both of the quantifiers out front, which is something that we haven't seen, so I wasn't expecting you to see this one. But this would be like saying there's a robot X, and there's an order Y, and X takes Y, and if all those conditions happen, then X receives Y. So that one was a little bit more complicated, and I didn't quite expect people to see that one. But I was a little bit more generous with this one just because the relative clause was hard to spot. What I did see that was, I think, the most common issue was the verbs themselves. And just this is what I want to point out when translating. So if you're going to make mistakes, sorry, let me figure out how to phrase this in my mind before saying it out loud so I don't say the wrong thing. Identifying whether a verb is intransitive, transitive, or ditransitive is one of the more important skills, not only in semantics, but like in syntax as well, in the syn-sem side of linguistics, so the syntax semantics side. So seeing words like takes an order and receives it, and understanding that, okay, this means that takes has a taker and a takee, something that is being taken and something that is doing the taking. And receives is sort of the same way. There's something doing the receiving and something that is being received. As long as you can get that bit down and you can make some sort of connection between what is being received and what is doing the receiving, at least at that point, you've demonstrated the really good attempts at linking those two. And then I can say, okay, although you might have not got the translation right, you've understood that these are transitive verbs and you understand what the receiver is and what the taker is. And then I can take a look at that and I can give some more leniency there. So even if you're not quite sure about how to do the translation, do try to consider whether the verb is transitive or intransitive and get those arguments there. Like, and when I mean arguments, I mean like the X's and the Y's. What is the taker? What is the receiver? And try to do some links with those. So in this case, an order is an object. It's the thing being taken. It's the thing being received. So that should match up with the Y, for example. So if you're a little lost, that's a really good place to start. Is just taking a step back and asking myself or asking yourself, like, is this a verb that takes one thing or is it a verb that takes two things? And what is it taking? Okay, D and E were really good. F was also really good. Not all taxpayers paid every single bill. I updated the solutions too for a question for F on the Canvas, so please do take a look at that. I think I made a translation mistake in my first attempt with one of the quantifiers, so I have fixed that. Turns out not scope ambiguous. Okay, 3 was done really well as well, so I don't need to quite take a look at that. 4, this is where people sort of fell apart. 1 and 2 were done really well. What I want to do is I want to contrast 1 and 3. And then when I take a look at 3, that'll explain how 4 and 5 are done. So this was sort of similar to what we did in the lecture slides when we did things like for all X, RXX, and then we did another one where we said like, is RAC true and so on. But what we didn't do in that slide is we didn't have something where I was like RXC because we didn't have assignment functions at that time. But there is a difference between these X's with the quantifier and this X without the quantifier. So in this question with X2, this is a free variable. And because it's free, what we need to do is we need to take a look at the assignment function and we need to see what it is. So if I am correct, and my memory serves me well, gx of 2 was s. So what this means is then we need to evaluate this and say, okay, is NSR true? And I believe S is near R in the alphabet, so that was true. Okay, so that was done well. Then 2 was done well, but then 3 came, and this same idea, unfortunately, was held to question 3. But 3 is different because 3 has a quantifier in front. This is bound. So this x1 behaves differently. We do not check the assignment function for this. Instead, we treat this as a bound variable. So this says there is some x1 such that bjx1. So if we paraphrase this into English, what this says is there is some letter x1 such that j occurs before x1 in the alphabet. This isn't specifying a specific letter. This is saying there is some letter. So you have to check the letters in the universe to see if you can find a letter where this works. So I can pick any letter I want. And in this case, I can pick Z. And because I can find one letter where this works, I can say, okay, yeah, this is true. There is some letter in the alphabet that J occurs before. So this is true. We only use the assignment function when the variable is free. And it's the same way with pronouns. Just like when we say she loves her, or every person loves herself, we only use the assignment function to evaluate that, like as a free pronoun, when it's not being bound by something. So for question 4 as well, when we said for all x2, well, it's bound there. There exists an x3, it's bound there, such that bx2, x3, or x2 equals z. What this is saying is that for every letter x2, there is some letter x3 such that x2 occurs before x3 or x2 is equal to z. So what this means is that every letter has another letter after it in the alphabet, or that letter is Z. So you can pick any letter A through Y for x2, and then you can always say, yeah, Z occurs after it. But as soon as you pick, say, Z for x2, well, suddenly there's no letter after Z, but it happens to be the case that Z equals Z. So this one is also true. And then 5 works the same way. Are there two letters where x1 is near x2, but x2 is not near x1? Well, no, that doesn't make sense. Because if x1 is near x2, then x2 has to be near x1. So these were only like 0.1 each. So very, very, very minor in terms of grading, but just an important piece of info for how to interpret these variables. If they're free, we check the assignment function. If they're bound, we treat them as like some or all. So yeah, I mean, like there's a lot of, there's not many slides in the course, but the slides are dense and there's a lot of information and a lot of practice that goes on. So like I understand how this can be missed when you go through the problems, and that this question in the slides might have been forgotten about. So not a huge penalty there. This question was fine too. I think there were some people that were confused about the instructions. So in the instructions, we had things like Vn is the set of pairs xy such that x is, I'll just paraphrase and say near y. So what this means, and I tried to give the hints above in this, that this means that in the translations you use nxy. So when translating these sentences, you would use these predicates. So some people were using things like VN and VA, and that's not quite how this was supposed to be done. It was supposed to be using things like NXY and AX and VX and CX. So the same types of predicates that were used in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But overall, the translations for 1, 2, 3, and 4 have been quite good so far, from what I've seen. Question 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so 5 and 7 were basically the same question. I tried to give as many hints as I could for this without giving it away. But again, these problems were not easy regardless. So what should happy X represent in terms of sets? So I tried to make this look like the problems earlier in the course, like way back in the relations and functions lecture. So when we talked about things like sleeps X, and then that goes back into the truth conditional meanings of sentence with F1. So when we had something like sleeps X, that would be like the set of X such that X sleeps in B. So that's how we did intransitive verbs. So the idea with happy X is that this would be treated the same way. That when we had happy X, this would be the set of X such that X is happy in V. So we treat it just the same way as we treated intransitive verbs. Then there was a little paragraph that said, oh, we might run into a problem because we have this V copula here, but then we find that the meaning of the adjective is the same as the meaning of the VP. So I sort of tried to drop that hint too there, that the adjective has the same meaning as the VP. So we have this thing called a semantically vacuous node. And what this means is that the V copula and is just don't have meaning. I think I wrote that out. So basically we ignore that in our trees. So we just don't give those meanings. So what's the rule then? If VP has the same meaning as adjective, how can we write a rule that says that the VP has the same meaning as adjective? And there's a couple ways to do this. Sort of the easiest way of doing this is just to write that the VP has the same meaning as adjective. That's sort of the easiest way you could do it. But there is a little bit more complicated of a way by writing it as a set, by writing it as a set of X, such that X is in the adjective. But both of these are exactly equivalent. So 2 ways of writing that out. And then for question C, if you do it node by node, happy, adjective, and the VP are all just this. And then the sentence and Sarah are what you've done before. So you can see that in the solutions, but that's how you would sort of run through question A and B. And question 7 was exactly the same. So 7 was a linguist. So the set of X such that X is a linguist in V. The VP is now equal to NC, and then the tree works out the same. And then there was question D, which was like, how do we do it if we have a tree where it's VP, a V cop, and then you have any sort of XP there, where XP ends up being grammatical. And then the idea was, well, you've seen 2 of them work out. So it's just that, well, if this doesn't have any meaning associated with it, and these 2 are the same thing, we can just say that the VP is equal to the XP. Or you can just say the more complicated route, that this is the set of X such that X is in the XP. There are 2 ways to write that. So again, like this, the result doesn't look complicated, but the process is not straightforward. So again, these are tough the first time you do them. So I tried to be generous with marketing. As long as you made some attempt of some sort, I don't think I gave you less than 50% for any sort of attempt on these problems. As long as there's some attempt, you'll always get half points on these difficult trees. But I think that's it. I think all the other problems were done quite well from what I've seen so far. And I'll try to make sure those marks are out by next class. The next test, or the last test, is on the 6th, Friday, next Friday. So at least you'll have the feedback then a week in advance. And do I have the test guide done? I don't think I have it posted on Canvas, but I do have the test guide. So let me just show you what this looks like.
Is it still 9 a.m. to 9 p.m.?
Yeah, it'll be 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. In fact, it's the final test, so I'm probably just going to extend it till, oh, it goes to a Saturday. I'll probably just make it Saturday till noon, just in case anyone wants the later Friday night test for whatever reason. So I'll post this on Canvas in a couple of days when I do finalize this, because I might make some last minute adjustments. But these are the questions so far. This is the breakdown. It'll be 3 predicate logic sentence translations. 1 sentence will be scope ambiguous. But these sentence translations will not be super difficult. The ones on the assignment are harder than the ones I'm giving you on the test. So 3 sentences it. 1 is scope ambiguous. I'll tell you which one is scope ambiguous. There'll be 2 assignment functions that have undergone modifications, just like question 3. I'll give you names and variables, so it's more like what we've seen in lecture rather than what you saw in the assignment with letters and numbers. So it's 1 question. That should be like a super fast question. The big question will be a compositional semantics tree. So this will not be a scope ambiguous tree. What will happen is there will be 1 quantifier on there and there will be 1 pronoun on there. So the idea is that the tree basically covers everything in that lecture. So it'll take about 20 minutes-ish, maybe more. Again, it's just 1 quantifier and 1 pronoun. So the pronoun might be free, it might be bound, I'm not sure. It'll vary depending on which version of the question you get. And I will give you the tree with the labeled nodes, just like I did for the previous test, to save you some time and to make sure that you all have the structure correct. Question 4 and 5 are on the last 2 lectures. So question 4 will be on tense logic woofs. They will be quite straightforward. They'll just use P, F, G, and H, and they will be just like the ones on the assignment, perhaps simpler. And then the very last question we'll talk about on Friday, this Friday, we'll go over, is classifying jokes as phonological incongruities, morphological incongruities, or syntactic congruities, and just briefly justifying your answer. Because we do have people in this course, as in every linguistics course and every course at SFU, who are not native English speakers, the joke is not going to be a complicated joke. It's going to be a very straightforward and perhaps not even funny joke, but you know that it's not meant. I'm just filling up the last 1.5 points because I couldn't figure out a way to add a question that was 1.5 points that was fast in time. So that's the honest truth. That's why there's a 1.5 points on jokes and pragmatics where you classify 1 joke as one of the congruities, because I couldn't think of what to add for that last 1.5%. So there you go. There's the most candid thing I've said on camera in the entire course. So I'll post this up on Canvas in the next 2 days when I make sure all the typos are gone and that these questions match exactly what I'm giving you on the actual test page. Because I do like to make sure that the instructions are pretty similar to what I'm doing. But the rules are going to be the same as test 2. So it's the same percentage, 12.5%. It'll be the same times. I'll just adjust it to make sure that everything is consistent. But yeah, that's it for today. That's it for tense and time. And on Friday, we start pragmatics and jokes. And then we'll finish up next Tuesday. We'll probably only have like an hour on Tuesday of actual lecture, and then we'll just wrap up the course and sort of talk about what there is in the future and what other semantics there is at SFU, which is barely anything. But yeah, I'll see you all Friday. And if you have any other questions, you're free to stick around. But thanks
Thank
for coming out
you.
today. See y'all.